This is Mr. Kaufman from High Five History with a short video on the Crusades. In this video I will introduce to you what the Crusades were, as well as go over 8 important events that were in and around the time of the Crusades that give you a sense of the conflict that occurred between the Christian Europe as well as the Muslim Middle East. So the Crusades are a series of wars over control of the Holy Land. The Holy Land being defined as the area along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, all anciently known as Palestine, including the very important city of Jerusalem. This area now is made up of modern-day Israel, Palestine, as well as Syria and Lebanon. Now, why is this a holy site? It's important in the religion and history of all 3 of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, as well as Islam. It was the ancient homeland for Jews. It's the area in which Jesus Christ lived, and Jerusalem being the place of his crucifixion as well as his resurrection, as well as Jerusalem being the site of Muhammad's night journey, right, where he ascended up to heaven to meet God. Now, it's a holy city for all 3 of these religions, as well as a popular pilgrimage site, meaning people from all 3 of these religions go to Jerusalem as for pilgrimage in order to show their faith to their religion. Now, to get a sense of the Crusades, it's important to start a little bit earlier and take a look at what was happening in what was the Muslim Empire. And during the time leading up to the Crusades, the Muslim Empire lacked some unity, and part of the reason is because a group of people called the Seljuk Turks, who had originally started off in Central Asia, had been slowly migrating into the Muslim Empire, taking over more and more land. Later, the Seljuk Turks convert to Islam, and what they end up doing is they expand their control and they get very close to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, which would have been the eastern most Christian empire or area. And so the Seljuks probably put a little pressure and made the people of Constantinople nervous. Now it is said that Seljuks also changed a little bit of the access to Jerusalem. Previously, even though Jerusalem and the surrounding area was controlled by Muslims for almost 400 years prior to this, traditionally Christians and Jews were allowed to come and go freely on pilgrimage sites, and while in some points they were treated unfairly, were protected for the most part. It is thought that Seljuk Turks might have changed this, although the definitive evidence is not so clear. Now, why did the Seljuks do this? To expand their territory as well as their power. Now, shortly after, about 20 years later, the Seljuks get even closer, within 100 miles of Constantinople. And in 1095, after repeated calls for help by the leaders of Constantinople, Pope Urban II called a meeting of all these bishops and cardinals and other important people in the Catholic Church to Clermont, France, where he essentially asked people to go on what he called a holy war, right, to go on the First Crusade to regain control of Jerusalem on behalf of Christians. Now, what he promised was people who would go to fight were fighting on behalf of God and therefore would able to gain salvation and a direct pass up into heaven. Now, the result of this is many nobles, right, peasants, merchants, and knights joined, right? They spend 9 months, right, tens of thousands of Crusaders, right, these European Christians, marched, right, over to Holy Land and began the First Crusade. So like I said, it took almost a year for them to march there, and the Crusades lasted several years, so our date would be 1096 to 1099. And again, where? Jerusalem, Anatolia, Palestine. And what ended up happening is the Crusaders won, right? They slowly and through much difficulty ended up conquering many cities in the Holy Land, including Jerusalem. And they ended up setting up 4 Christian Crusader kingdoms, right? So they kept and divided up some of the land into their own and stayed there. As a result, shortly after, about 50 years, the Muslim Empire kind of reorganized itself, and they then went on the attack. And they took back Edessa and Damascus, right? And then this caused the European Crusaders to start a Second Crusade. mostly French and German soldiers went to try to retake Edessa. However, they failed. So the Muslims were able to retake a lot of the Holy Land, and they were able to take back some of the Christian Crusader kingdoms. Now, they weren't able to take back all of them, right, until a little bit later, when you have Salah ad-Din, or Saladin as known, or as Europeans call them, right, took more control and further organized the Muslim Empire and ended up taking Jerusalem. Now, what this did is it got the Europeans obviously upset, and it inspires King Richard I, aka Lionheart, to lead an army to recapture, or to try to recapture the land from Salah ad-Din and the Muslims. Now, both of them were successful military leaders, and they end up in a stalemate. They both had some prisoners. They tried to make a deal. Lionheart actually backs out of it and kills almost 3,000 Muslim prisoners. But after many months and several years of fighting, they end up calling a truce. And what happens is Crusaders keep some of the cities along the Palestine and along places of the Holy Land. However, the Muslims keep control of Jerusalem and some other major cities with the promise to let Christian pilgrims come and go. Now, that's the third and maybe final official crusade. Now, you do have in 1212, shortly after, what's called the Children's or Poor People's Crusade. And the exact history of this is not so clear, but the idea is that thousands of children and poor people from Europe tried to organize themselves and to march into the Holy Land. Although it's a failure. Most of them don't even make it there. They're sold off to slavery or just kind of disappear into history. So again, while it's not totally sure exactly what happens, it's an interesting event nonetheless. Now, in 1291, we do have another step in the Crusades, or the fight over control of the Holy Land and the city of Acre. What ends up is Muslims decide to take the city back, which had been the first Christian Crusader city and had been controlled by Christians now for several hundred years, and they do. All right, so they successfully defeat the Christians there, and they reestablish control in the region. Now, the last event that I'm going to include in the Crusades, even though it's not an actual Crusade event, however, it is a fight between Christians and Muslims, and that's the Reconquista. Now, the major players in this are King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, also famous for sending off Christopher Columbus. And you also notice the date 1492 is the same. And their goal was to retake the Iberian Peninsula and make it a Catholic kingdom, right? Make it part of Spain. If you remember back, the Muslims took control of this several years later, and they are successful. They end up having, they take control of the Iberian Peninsula, and they make it a Catholic Spanish kingdom. And that was it. And modern-day Spain, modern-day Portugal is shaped through the work of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And this would be then the last event in the Crusades, and wrapping up here this video and the look in the Crusades, right, the fight over the Holy Land between the Christians and the Muslims.